Hello, today I'm taking a look at the Minisforum MS-A1. This is the AMD sibling of the very popular Minisforum MS-A1. So this thing features a socketed AMD Ryzen AM5 processor, a whack ton of I/O, M.2, U.2 even, 2.5 gig Ethernet, Oculink, bunch of other wild stuff. So if that sounds good to you, come along on this adventure. This video is sponsored by the Glide Easy retractable charger. The Glide Easy charger is easy to carry in your backpack, and it combines the charger with an 80 centimeter retractable cable. Gallium nitride power electronics support all of the common USB power delivery voltages with up to 30 watts delivered in a small package and a flat cable. With the retractable cable, you can charge your devices on the go without cable clutter. It also has a Type-C female port if you want to bring your own cable or charge two devices at once. So I'm often moving around with the robotics students, and having a portable charger like this in my bag is great if I need to charge my laptop from intense CAD work. Of course, I also daily drive a MacBook Air, so a 35-watt charger is a perfect match for my laptop. It's all I need. Get yours at the link below. Quick before I get started, Minisforum did send me this unit free of charge for review. No money changed hands. They won't see the review before you do. Ordinarily, I would not contact a manufacturer like this during the review process once I've confirmed that I've received the package. However, this was a bit special, so more on that at the end of the video. You'll see what I mean. So let's take this guy out of the box and see what we got. So we got PC itself, the world's junkiest power brick, also piano black, glossy, gonna get full of fingerprints. 240 watts, Jesus. A power cable, an HDMI cord, a little metal clip, a little mystery PCB, which appears to be M.2 to U.2. So the unit itself, we got a pretty bare front, lots of ventilation holes. It's got a headphone jack, two USB 3 and a USB 2. Like, I can't emphasize enough how heavy this thing is. This is all metal. There's a huge cooling grill here. This weighs a lot. So on the back side, we got 2.5 gig Ethernet, DisplayPort, HDMI Type-C, USB 3, USB 2, and Oculink. So what do you think? Should I boot it up first, or should I tear it down first? How about tear down? So we got this beautiful aluminum heatsink. Flip it over. We got 8 screws here. So we can, oh, what the heck just happened? 8 screws here along the bottom, and take out. So just notice some of these screws are different lengths. So I actually didn't pay attention to which was which, but got 4 short ones and 2 long ones. So long ones must be in the middle. That'll be frustrating. Okay, total count is 6 short ones and 2 long ones, and I have no idea where the long ones go. Something is now loose on the inside, but the cover did not come off. There we go. Okay, so now the front panel can come off. Kinda. So looks like this thing is built with plastic snaps, which I guess kind of fall apart when you take the bottom off. On the bottom cover, we have this nice mesh grill here for dust. Something is still moving inside. I am not sure what. The front side looks like we have 2 antennas for the radios. Oh, that did not feel good, but there we go. It's coming off. That's what came off. This thing. How did this thing come off? This is a heatsink. There are 2 screw holes here and here, which should bolt this down, but there are no screws. Oh, there's a screw right there. Right there. It's stuck in the fin. So now where's the other screw? It's just gone. Looking at the underside of this, we have a bunch of thermal gap pads. One of them is really thick and 2 of them are thin. This one looks like it's for cooling M.2s, and these 2 are for cooling the RAM. So if we look under here, there's 2 sticks of RAM. They each have a thermal spreader on them. The lower one would make contact with that super thick pad, the upper one with the thin pad, and then there's an M.2 slot here and here. Oh, I see how this works. Wow, this is stupid. Okay, so see what's going on now. These two are the M.2 drives. The M.2 drives are held in by this little standoff and this little standoff. Those same standoffs hold in the heatsink. So this thing here is held in by the screws that hold the drives in. So I got some drives. So I can put the drive in, and then it's just going to flop up like that until I hold it down. And same with the other one. It's going to flop up like that until I hold it down. But I can't screw them in. I instead have to get the heatsink on top of them, push the heatsink down, and line it up with the two screws that hold both the drive and the heatsink. And I lost a screw, and my other screw is wedged in a fin here. This is bizarre. Toolless M.2s should be a thing. So I'm going to put in two 980s. These are both PCIe Gen 4, so we'll see later which of these slots is actually Gen 4. There is no way this screw is long enough. That is not going to happen. So the hole in the heatsink is really big, and if I put the screw through here, like that screw is way smaller than the heatsink. Maybe that's intentional so you can line it up more easily, but the screw that they sent is definitely not long enough. I don't know if you can see that there. Well, I guess I only have one M.2 because I only have one screw. Guess I'll hold the other one in with tape. Or just the weight of this heatsink. On the RAM side, what do we got here? These are kind of well attached. So here is one stick of the RAM it came with. So this is a 16 gig stick, DDR5 5600 megatransfers. There's two sticks, so we get 32 gigs. Okay, flipping the unit over, what have we got on the back side? Well, we got a number of things going on here. So it looks like my unit included an SSD. I never really know when I get review units if they're going to include SSDs or not. So here we've got an M.2 Wi-Fi and an M.2 SSD, and then another M.2 SSD here. I'm going to test later and see what the bandwidth of all these slots is with LSPCI, so stick around for that. Now it looks like it would be really hard to get this M.2 out, so if I take the screw out here, that's a really long screw. So this is a really long screw. This screw is probably meant to go on the other side with the heatsink, but somehow ended up on this side. That's still stuck. It's stuck under this cooler. So this fan is quite attached to the M.2, and I am having a hard time getting it off without breaking this connector down here. There we go. This extrusion extends over the top of the SSD to cool the SSD. That also means that it's effectively glued together, and you have to take them out together. So I got a little cable here for the fan. They couldn't put the connector right on the board. Now that I scavenged an M.2 screw from the other side, I'm going to put this other SSD in. So I put the short screw there and the long one here, and it kind of works, but it's a little bit crooked. So over on this side, in theory, we can put a U.2 drive here. So this is an M.2. So I take another M.2, put it in there, and it's got a standoff, but I don't have a screw for it because I could use that screw there. But they also sent a U.2 carrier card. So for those of you who've never seen it before, this is what a U.2 drive looks like. It looks a lot like a 2.5-inch SSD, but it's about twice as thick. So here is a cheapest of cheap SSD, and these are usually about 7 millimeters thick. This guy is considerably thicker. It's the same form factor as a 2.5-inch SAS, like 15,000 RPM enterprise drive. So I should be able to just pop the drive in here. Now I got 4 screw holes on the back for my U.2 drive, and I can put my U.2 drive in an M.2 slot. Now again, there is no baggie of screws, so I'm looking on the motherboard for screws I can take. It looks like these were intended for that purpose, but they're the wrong thread. So anyway, I need screws to mount the drive and it didn't come with them. So next up, there's a whole bunch of warnings here about damaging M.2s. So there's a switch on the board that says U.2, M.2, and it defaults to the U.2 position, so be careful. But this changes the voltage on this connector, I believe from 12 volt to 5 volt, because U.2s need 12 volts. So it looks like this standoff is for an M.2, and these 3 are for a U.2. And it looks like I need to take this screw out so the screw head doesn't hit the carrier. No. This looks too tall already. So I don't know if you can see that from your point of view, but it's bigger than the case. I don't think the case is going to fit with this U.2 in here. Finally, time to put the case back on. It's got these nice plastic rails here that make it easy to slide on in theory. So now, the problem. This drive is too tall. So it looks like the case cannot fit a 15mm U.2 drive. So I guess I'll just leave the case off. So, Apple art and editing later. Here are the 2.5-inch form factor dimensions. So here's an engineering drawing, form factor of 2.5-inch drive. They call out the thickness of the drive here as being A1 plus A2 minus A3. So A1 is the nominal, and A2 and A3 are our tolerance. Coming up to this table, it looks like we have a bunch of options for A1 ranging from 5mm up to 19mm. So in my experience, 7, 9, and 15 are the most common sizes. I also looked up the datasheet on a random SSD from Micron, and it is in fact 15mm. So, time to power it up. Leaving the bottom off because of this U.2 drive. Hooked up to my HDMI capture setup. I don't think any operating system was included, but I guess I'll figure that out. And if there is, I'll back it up. I've got a Debian live CD, so we can go through what bandwidth each of the M.2 slots has and the other devices. I've also got 10 gig hooked up. It's only a 2.5 gig NIC, but should still negotiate down. Actually, 10 gig doesn't automatically work with 2.5. This specific 10 gig switch does work with 2.5. Nope, that's Windows. Nope, we're not going to do Windows today. So we're in the BIOS now. This is actually a really nice looking BIOS. Setup or boot options? Probably setup. Okay, this looks very unique. Do I need a mouse for this? Oh, I have a mouse. Cool. This looks like we got the 8700G with Radeon graphics, 32 gigs of RAM. Let's see, NVMe Windows Boot Manager. I would like to boot to USB, followed by Windows Boot Manager. So first up, we have the included SSD. This is PCIe Gen 4, and it's running at Gen 4 by 4. So it looks like Wi-Fi card is running at Gen 2 by 1. That's fine. 2.5 gig Ethernet running at Gen 2 by 1. The front port that supports U.2 or M.2 supports PCIe Gen 4 by 4. The rear M.2 closer to the CPU runs at Gen 4 by 1. And the back slot further from the CPU is limited to Gen 3 by 4. Since it showed a USB 4 Thunderbolt controller in the device topology, I didn't think this thing supported that. There's only one Type-C port. I'm going to try and plug it in and see if it does Thunderbolt. Well, that looks like it worked. Yeah, Thunderbolt link came up. Okay, so I'm getting about 10 gig over Thunderbolt, which is about what I expect for Thunderbolt. That is a pleasant surprise to get Thunderbolt. I don't know where the second Thunderbolt port went. So one Thunderbolt is what you get. So next up, I'm going to do a power consumption test. So just sitting here at idle, it's drawing roughly 12 to 12.5 watts. So I have it set up with two SSDs installed. So the 1 terabyte it came with and another Samsung. I'm connected to Ethernet, I'm connected to HDMI, and I'm connected to USB. And I'm running Debian Linux, which is fully installed and running on the system. So that's my baseline configuration, I guess, for idle power consumption. Take with that information what you will. So I took the case off again because I'm done with thermal testing for now. And I found an interesting problem, and I want to document it for you guys. I'm not sure how it will resolve yet, but basically, this board has two Realtek 2.5 gigabit Ethernet cards. And they're both PCI Express, and they're both in the back here. And as I've been testing this, I've been plugging my Ethernet cord into one of them randomly, expecting it to get an IP address and work. And so far it has. However, I just rebooted it with some different SSDs plugged in, and it didn't work. And I thought, what the hell? So I checked in IP, like the Linux command, IP, and only one card showed up. So I switched my network cable to the other card, and it worked. And if I was manually configuring Ethernet, I would have expected that, but the card didn't show up at all. It was completely gone from LSPCI and from IP, and there was only one card. So I've been taking different drives out, moving drives around, and if I take this drive out of this slot, then the second card comes back in LSPCI, but it still doesn't load the driver. So on Linux, I get an error that says EIO PCI read failure, and it doesn't continue to configure that device, it only configures the other one. Given that I think these two network cards are the same part number, this to me would indicate a hardware failure, because there can't be a driver difference on Linux if it's the same part number chip. But I'm going to keep digging, and I'll tell you guys what I find. Yeah, scratch that. I moved cards around again, so I took out this blue one, which is the one that came with it, that has Windows on it. I moved my Linux one around, and last time I did this, the card showed up, and I got the EIO read error, and now the card's just gone entirely from LSPCI. So I'm guessing that either the network card or something else on the board is starting to fail, on this PCIe lane specifically. I don't know if it's the NIC chip or something else on the board, but something about that Ethernet port has failed, and I will have to talk to Minisforum about it. So next up, I want to dive into the processor heatsink socket, that system. See how easy it is to take apart, how easy it would be to add your own CPU. Now this thing is supposed to have a socketed AM5 processor, and if I look really closely in there I can see a socket, so that's completely what I expect, but I want to see what it looks like. So I already took out the M.2 cooler. As far as I can tell, this fan is really just to cool M.2, so it sits here. This heatsink is for the M.2, which I took out. It's a huge pain to take out because of how the SSD is stuck to it. So I put my own SSD in that has Linux on it that I've been using for testing. This, I believe, is the back plate for the system. I'm not sure if I'm going to have to take these screws out or not, so I'm going to flip it over and see what's going on. So this whole unit cools the CPU. The CPU itself is underneath here. I don't believe there's actually a chipset at all, but I guess we'll see if there's a chipset. So looking carefully in here, I don't know if you can see in this gap here, there's a heat pipe that goes sideways, so it goes from the CPU here over to this fan. Then there's an additional fan on top, so both fans cool the CPU. So looking in here, it looks like these screws all attach the fan to the bracket, and I really want to take the entire bracket off. So it looks like I'll have to take this bracket off here, which looks like it's 4 screws. Okay, so these screws came out. Now there's 4 studs here that are pressed into this plate. And I believe these are the CPU mounting bracket. So I believe these 4 screws go to the fan, and then these 4 come in from the other side for the mounting bracket. So now the question is, do I have to take off the fan screws, or can I just pull up on the whole heatsink? It doesn't seem to want to come out. So I'm going to pop the screws on this fan. Looks like I got one more over here. Oh no, that's my missing screw. There it is, stuck to a piece of tape. This is the screw I was missing earlier from the M.2s. Could potentially be a screw in here. I can't tell if it's for the heatsink or just for the circuit board though. There we go. So for those following along at home, there's a screw down in this hole that goes through the heatsink, through the board, into the other side. There's 4 screws that pop up from the other side from the CPU mounting plate. You don't have to take off these screws for the fans. So this is their cooling solution. Looks like they've masked on some thermal paste that they've applied, and they've got some thermal gap pads here for the VRM. This looks like a non-conductive coating to avoid shorting out the board underneath it. So there's the socket itself. It's even got the AMD Ryzen symbol on it. It's nice. So in here we've got the VRM. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 inductors there. Some of those will be memory, some of those will be core. I'm going to guess that the vast majority of these chips are involved in voltage regulation. I don't have a microscope, so I can't actually read the numbers, but just VRMs, no chipset. So I don't really have to take this out, but I kind of want to look at it. Of course, you need to be extremely careful with these little guys here so you don't break them. So yeah, there's the socketed CPU we were promised. It's right there. So since this thing has Oculink, I decided that it would be fun to try it with my collection of odd PCIe cards. So I could of course test it with something boring like a GTX 1050. Why would I do that when I have this chonker? At least if I had enough power to power this thing. Or what about a 25 gig router on a PCIe card? Huh. I think Minisforum has a docking station for this for GPUs, but they didn't send it to me. So I went on Amazon and I bought this thing, which was pretty cheap. Lets you put in a full X16 PCIe card and power it from a 24-pin ATX power supply. And of course, I need an Oculink cable too, which I got right here. And a whole other power supply just to power my graphics card. So anyway, these are the 2 cards I'm actually going to be trying out. This is an Intel X520, which is a super basic 10 gig card. This basically should work with everything. I believe it's PCIe Gen 2. And as a slightly bigger challenge, the MikroTik CRS 2004 PCIe. Bit of an oddity, but it would love being powered separately from the host. Maybe like a box or something. Okay, so slot the card in. It's got a power switch here. I'll leave that off. I guess that's in enough. Now this cable is microscopically small, so I really don't want to break it as I plug it in. I feel like I'm using one of those weird crypto risers where you get like 1 lane of PCI over USB 3 cables. But like actual good PCI. That feels jank. This thing wants to tip over. There we go. So on my first boot, I forgot to power on the external power supply, which is a thing you need with Oculink because there's no power. And of course nothing happened. So I powered it on, rebooted the system, and right there, Intel 82599, 10 gigabit network connection. Yep, so we got 10 gigs. Well, that was easy. How about trying a more difficult card now? Yes, so that PCI device, Qualcomm, Atheros, Gigabit Ethernet, those four of them, those are the MikroTik card. Now MikroTik took a bit of a strange approach with this card. It emulates as a PCI slave for very common Gigabit Ethernet cards. So Linux will load the driver, Windows will load the driver without having to install a driver. It's not actually made by Qualcomm or Atheros. It's actually 25 gig, not 1 gig. I'll only connect with the 10 gig DAC, so these guys both negotiated 10 gig, although the other side is actually a 25 gig Mellanox card. But it does appear that my PCI Express is working just fine. So I know this is only PCIe Gen 3, but I don't actually own any add-in cards that are PCIe Gen 4. So I have a bunch of SSDs that are Gen 4, but those are M.2. I don't have an M.2 carrier to go into PCIe slot, so Gen 3 is what you get a test of. And it works great. So what is my final verdict on the Minisforum MS-A1? Well, it's complicated. So currently, this thing is available as a bare bones unit, which is motherboard, cooler, that kind of stuff. No CPU, no RAM, no SSD. Or as a completely assembled unit that includes a Ryzen 8700G APU, which is a socketed AM5 CPU, a 1 terabyte NVMe Gen 4x4 SSD, and RAM. I think it has 32 gigs. So as of the recording of this video, those two options are $260 bare bones, or $730 with the APU and the SSD and the RAM and Windows. So then that leads to two questions. First off, is that a good value for that price? And second off, is this the box you want for your home lab? Is this what you want to run Proxmox, whatever containers you're running? If you want TrueNAS, is it for that? What is this good for in your setup? So to me, this thing and also the Minisforum MS-A1 before it are really trying to be a lot of different things and squeeze as much as they possibly can into a small package. And a lot of people I don't think need a lot of those things. So for example, this thing comes with an adapter for a U.2 SSD. So if you're buying a U.2 SSD for your home lab, it's probably going to be used, and it's probably going to be 15 millimeters thick, which won't fit in this case. Now, if you're the kind of person that wants a 15 millimeter thick, high capacity U.2 SSD, I have a 4 terabyte one and they come a lot bigger than that, then you're probably looking for high speed, all solid state storage that needs a lot of bandwidth. And this CPU, the 8700G, is absolutely going to handle that kind of bandwidth, at least for the size and scale. But what's not is the 2.5 gig Ethernet. So this guy's got two 2.5 gig Ethernet interfaces. They're Realtek based. Absolutely nothing wrong with Realtek. However, one of them failed on me, and as of the recording of this video, Minisforum didn't respond to my questions about it. So I don't know what kind of thing you're doing with like 10 terabytes of NVMe storage in this thing, but it's not going over the network with 2.5 gig NICs. Now you could of course use Oculink to connect a 10 gig or a 25 gig card, like I did in this video, but then you can't connect a higher end graphics card or something else fancy. So what are you actually going to do with this? I guess you call it like a sibling of this unit, the Minisforum MS-A1. That one has 10 gig built in, so that makes a lot of sense. You have dual 10 gig and dual 2.5 gig. That's a lot of bandwidth. Now you do also have Thunderbolt. This chip has 2 Thunderbolt controllers, but they only brought out one of them. And that's a questionable decision to me. I don't know where the other one went. I think it went to a USB hub that does a number of USB 3 ports. But I would have rather had 2 Type-C Thunderbolt ports to make a ring network or a cluster network instead of more USB Type-A USB 3 ports. Now, another thing that I don't like about this thing is the case. Now, I've seen some bad cases in my day here, like the one with magnets, but this thing has 8 screws to take it apart. And it feels like you're going to break the bezel every time, and these screws are a huge pain, and this piece of metal here doesn't honestly fit that well with the bezel. I'll get a close-up so you can see what I mean. And every time I'm reassembling it, I feel like I have to force it into place. It's also 8 screws to get to literally anything, and I got to take the whole bezel off and take the whole case out to get to the back side. And if it was easier to take the whole case off, that'd be fine. If I could just pull the case off with maybe 2 screws, that'd be nice. But 8 screws is kind of a lot, and every time I had to take this thing apart to change out SSDs, I hated it. Now, of course, for the right price, I am very quick to overlook any flaws in the case or just leave it bare, honestly. And so I would not consider that to be a huge downside for most PCs. This one is on the more expensive side compared to other stuff I've reviewed, but at the same time, it's also a lot more performant with the 8700G. instead of something like a low-end Intel N100, or I mean, the N100's a pretty awful CPU, to be honest. I'm also still a bit concerned by that rattling heatsink. I did eventually find both of the heatsink screws, and both of them are too short. So I'm not sure what they intended with that heatsink for the two bottom SSDs. Honestly, that seems like a lot of overkill to me. I mean, one of them is connected at Gen 4x1. That's pretty slow. And the other is connected at Gen 3x4, which is actually a lot faster than Gen 4x1, funnily enough. And the two RAM sticks. And all of them are in an area that has ventilation and airflow. So that was a really big heatsink for those four components, the two sticks of RAM, the two SSDs. It doesn't have a fan on it, and it was rattling around. It didn't have the right screws, so sus. As for the CPU cooler, I thought that was very nice. I took it apart, obviously. You saw it, the socketed processor. It's in there as you expect, and I didn't have any problems with the cooling solution for the processor. And speaking of heatsinks as well, the heatsink on the front SSD was absolutely maddening. So the SSD that came with the unit was 1 terabyte, it was blue, and it was stuck to the heatsink. And I could not figure out how to get the heatsink off or the SSD out until I realized that they were one part. And you basically have to take them out together, and it's kind of a tricky thing to get in. And then, because that cools just the one M.2, the other M.2 on that side of the board, which is the U.2/M.2 slot, doesn't have any cooling, which again I don't think is a problem, realistically. It has ventilation in that area, but trade-offs. And also, speaking of that combo U.2/M.2, I really think U.2 is a bad choice for this unit, especially the way they implemented that switch. There's a switch on the board that changes the voltage from 3.3 volt, which is normal M.2, to adding 5 and 10 volts. I'm not sure if they're using extra pins or something like that, but they're using pins for higher voltages than they're supposed to be used for. And that's not a problem if the connector isn't also used for other things, but this is a standard M.2 connector, and you could blow up your SSD. I almost did that. I had the switch in the wrong place, but my SSD survived. It just didn't turn on. So I would have liked to see like a second connector next to it for the extra voltages, or a pogo pin, or really anything to supply those 5 and 12 volt rails for the U.2. But the U.2 doesn't fit anyway, so I don't know who's going to be using it. So ultimately, after all the hype I've seen around the Minisforum MS-A1, I was very excited to take a look at the MS-A1, the AMD cousin. And it didn't disappoint performance-wise, or even value-wise, I don't think. It is a pretty performant unit for the price, and it does have a decent amount of I/O and expansion. But there's just a lot of things that are odd about it to me. And I would have, depending on what you're using it for, you might be better off with something simpler that has less expansion, or more networking, or just SSDs, or something like that. There's a lot of other NAS units or small desktop units in this price range that specialize in something else very well. And this I don't think specializes in anything particularly well. So that's my opinion. Like I said earlier, I did reach out to Minisforum about the networking issue. It has currently been 2 days and I haven't heard back yet. So I guess you'll see a cut in this video if they did respond to me. But anyway, I have a Discord server link down below if you want to chat with me. If you want to buy any of the things in this video, the Minisforum or the little Oculink stuff I got, I can link down below for that. Also like to thank my sponsor Gitrion and those cool expanding USB chargers. If you want to link those are down below as well. As always, I'll see you guys on the next adventure.